in Donald Trump's America, it's starting to feel like if you take up a court case, if you act in a way that is against what Donald Trump wants, you are there to be punished.
If the executive is essentially sapping all the power from the other branches of government, then is this still a democracy that Trump is working in?
So was this just saying we ignore the courts altogether because it looks pretty close to that? Or was it something else?
I never did defy a court order.
And you wouldn't in the future?
No, you can't do that. However, we have bad judges. We have very bad judges. And these are judges that shouldn't be allowed. I think at a certain point you have to start looking at what do you do when you have a rogue judge. The judge that we're talking about, you look at his other rulings, rulings unrelated, but having to do with me, he's a lunatic.
Trump is at war with the law. Not for the first time, you might think. But it appears to have reached a climax this week because Trump is calling on one individual judge to be impeached because he doesn't like his ruling.
By all means, get rid of a judge if they are drunk, if they don't turn up for work, if they do any number of other things. But the judge's job is to interpret the law. And Donald Trump doesn't want that. And so people have started to talk about America potentially entering a constitutional crisis because Donald Trump wants to break down the independence of the judiciary. How seriously should we be taking that? Welcome to the News Agents USA.
The News Agents USA.
It's John.
It's Emily. And this week we have been looking at the deportation of Venezuelans, predominantly Venezuelan men, who are being sent to El Salvador under what is called the Alien Enemies Act. It's a very old act. It's 1798 and it is rarely used outside of wartime. And Donald Trump has decided it's a very efficient way of deporting migrants he doesn't want, without trial, without any knowledge of what they have or haven't done. He just wants them out of America and he's sending them to El Salvador.
And of course, one of the cornerstones of any democracy is due process, is that the law is seen to run its course and that due process happens so that you don't just have people summarily loaded onto a plane and shoved off to some other country where you do not know what treatment they are going to get. And yet, what we've seen with this transportation of these Venezuelans to El Salvador, and I should say it is accompanied by the most extraordinary video released by the El Salvadorian government, and the music bed that you're going to hear in a second put on by the El Salvadorian government is just designed to show how tough they are. The guys, the prisoners, are manacled in shackles. They are bent double, forced to bent double, walk
Head shaved.
It is brutal. Now, you may not like gang members. You may not like anything that they stand for or may have done, but there has been no due process of criminal conviction. They've just been kicked out.
So at this point, the courts step in. They say it's one thing to want to deport. It's one thing to get elected on a policy of deportations. It's one thing to hate gang members. We don't know anything about the men that you are sending back on these planes now. And we think that Donald Trump has overstepped his powers. And so one judge, Boasberg, has come in and said, you're not doing that. We are going to stop those planes from taking off. We are not going to have those men sent to El Salvador without due process. And Donald Trump has turned round and, as you heard in that clip at the beginning, said, who is this lefty lawyer? The guy was actually appointed by George Bush, but forget that for a moment. Who is this guy who thinks he can overrule me, overrule the executive, overrule the president? I don't like what he said. Moreover, I would like to see Boasberg impeached, brought down, humiliated, essentially out of a job.
And that is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that the judge issued an order saying, I need more information.
Yeah.
So I want the expulsion or the transportation or whatever of these people to stop pending that. The planes took off anyway. Now, there are some varying different excuses given. where the White House is saying, no, we weren't ignoring the court order, but when we got the written instruction to stop the flights, the planes were already in the air over international waters, and therefore we had no jurisdiction. So was this just saying we ignore the courts altogether because it looks pretty close to that? Or was it something else? I mean, so the legal justification that the White House are giving looks pretty threadbare.
Either way, the planes took off. And Trump has essentially sent out his henchmen onto Fox News, his border czar, to explain why they thought it was well within their right to ignore the judge's ruling. Here he is.
We made a promise to the American people. The President Trump has made a promise to the American people. We're going to make this country safe again. I wake up every morning loving my job because I work for the greatest president in the history of my life, and we're going to make this country safe again. I'm proud to be a part of this administration. We're not stopping. I don't care what the judges think. I don't care what the left thinks. We're coming.
We don't care what the courts say. We can do what we like. And there is this kind of constitutional anomaly that you have the Supreme Court of the United States, those 9 storied judges who are there for life, who make all the rulings and interpret the law. They don't enforce the law. And what does the Supreme Court do? If they make a judgment, they have no means of enforcement. The Justice Department, which is part of the administration, enforces the law. And the Justice Department say, we're not going to enforce the law. Then that is when you have a constitutional crisis. The Supreme Court says no, and the Justice Department shrugs. And that is where people think this is heading. The thing that strikes me so markedly about what happened in Trump's first term and what happens now is that the first term, it was accidental. It was chaos. It was make it up as you go along. There was no strategy. There was just, this has happened, well, we'll do this instead. Oh, we can't do that, well, we'll do something else.
Well, like the Muslim ban, where they kind of wanted to have a fight. They brought it on themselves. They pushed back against the appeals. And nobody can actually remember at the end of the day whatever happened to the Muslim ban, but it was kind of symptomatic of wanting to have a fight.
Exactly.
Right?
This time round, they know what they're doing. There is strategy in all of this. They are trying to assert that the president has absolute power. And this is the new reality that we are in America, and that the president is pushing at the boundaries of what the US Constitution says he can do.
You know, if you ask the average American whether they care more about the rule of law, this kind of very lofty, abstract ideal, or more about deportating potential criminals and gang members, more people, the president's assuming, will say, get rid of them, right? So they've picked as their test case something that has huge popular appeal. Oh, you can keep your rule of law. Oh, I don't know what that is. I just want the criminals out of America. And so from that perspective, once again, we're talking about the court of law versus the court of public opinion. And public opinion, Trump thinks, is firmly on his side.
So we all know, for example, in America, there is the First Amendment guaranteeing the right to free speech, the right to protest, the right to express an opinion, however obnoxious you might find it. But that is the sort of, again, absolutely foundational to the United States of America. Last week, we saw the deportation of a Lebanese doctor, kidney specialist, who is working at Brown University, one of the kind of most prestigious Ivy League colleges in the US, because she had expressed support for Hezbollah. Now, you may not like her views on Hezbollah. You may not like Hezbollah. When she was back in Lebanon, she went to the funeral of the leader of Hezbollah. But that has been used as grounds to throw her out of the country because she expressed that viewpoint. And the court said, no, you can't do this. And they did it anyway.
Yeah, and it's happening to commercial law firms as well. So over the last couple of weeks, Trump has been tightening the grip on law firms that he has taken against because he has perceived them to have worked against him in his first term. So Paul Weiss was one of the law firms that he decided was set against him because they investigated his payment to Stormy Daniels. You'll remember the case of the whole Manhattan trial. Perkins Coie is another firm that he decided he was dead against because, in his words, they were working for Hillary Clinton over that Russia dossier back in 2016. So what has he done to these firms? He hasn't just blacklisted them in his head. He's cut them off from government contracts. He's restricted their lawyers from entering government buildings. And he's making their clients know that they are on the wrong side. So they are hemorrhaging clients, in other words, business, which is an existential threat for these firms. They are now facing a government that is trying to literally shut them down, take away their work, cut their financing off. It is slightly akin, I'm going to say, to what we saw so prevalently in the 1950s, the kind of McCarthyism, where if you were tarnished with this idea of communism in any shape or form, you were out. You could not carry on existing in that administration.
And it may well be that the courts will rule that what the president has done with these law firms is unconstitutional.
Yeah.
And there is certain pushback going. But even if those law firms win, who is going to give them business when they're so much on the naughty step with Donald Trump? And one of the firms out in Seattle has been told it's lost its national security clearance, so it can't go into Boeing. Well, Boeing is huge in Seattle. That means effectively you've been cut off.
Yeah.
So you may lose the case, but Donald Trump
Or you may win the case.
Or you may win the case, but Donald Trump will succeed in absolutely eviscerating these law firms because they have worked on the taxi rank principle that is, again, a cornerstone, which is if someone seeks legal representation, they're entitled to it. They're entitled to it. But in Donald Trump's America, it's starting to feel like if you take up a court case, if you act in a way that is against what Donald Trump wants, you are there to be punished.
Yeah. And I guess the question at the heart of this, really, is if the executive is essentially sapping all the power from the other branches of government, then is this still a democracy that Trump is working in or wants to work in?
Well, joining us now from New York is Gregg Nunziata, who is the executive director of the Society for the Rule of Law, which in kind of normal times you would imagine wouldn't be that busy an organisation, but right now does seem to have its work cut out. These are extraordinary times, it feels.
They are. I mean, we are testing the very foundations and basic principles of our constitutional order in ways we've not seen, certainly in my lifetime. The president and his administration are deliberately inviting challenges with the courts and questioning the authority of the courts and the rule of law. So we are in very much uncharted waters on multiple fronts.
You say uncharted waters. Are we yet in a constitutional crisis, which is what I've read in some circles, or is that hyperbole at this stage?
Somewhere between the two. I mean, we're not there yet, but you can see it on the horizon. The administration has been, let's say, a bit fast and loose with some lower court orders, have not been quick to comply, but have tended to dress their recalcitrance around technicalities or excuses that maybe facially have some appeal. The real crisis comes if the administration directly refuses to comply with a court order, particularly one backed up by the U.S. Supreme Court. So we're not there yet, but there's a campaign of intimidation and delegitimization of the judiciary by the White House and its allies. So we certainly kind of see the battle lines forming, and it's alarming. You know, our system is based on the separation of powers between the legislature, the executive, and the courts. The legislature is lying down on the job, and the Republican majority is being permissive of the president doing all sorts of things that really should be in their province. And then the remaining bulwark is the courts. And the courts don't have an army or a police force to enforce their orders. We kind of rely on a culture that respects legal rulings. And previous presidents have respected legal rulings, even ones they didn't agree with. I first came to Washington to work in the Justice Department in the Bush administration, and the George W. Bush certainly received rulings from the Supreme Court, particularly regarding aspects of the war on terror that he disagreed with, but he complied. President Obama complied with adverse rulings from the Supreme Court. Instead, you have this president and his allies, particularly the vice president, suggesting that there is something illegitimate about the courts restraining the president in any way.
Greg, let's get you to spell out for us what you think is going on here, because there is I guess, warfare on two fronts. There is warfare with what feels like the federal judiciary, and then there is also warfare with commercial law firms, which are coming under attack. So if we look at the war, basically, that Trump is waging now on the federal judiciary, this comes down to a ruling about a very old act, the Alien Enemies Act, and whether Trump could deport people, Venezuelans, to El Salvador without any proof of what they had actually done. Now, he's told he can't, and he then essentially sets his dogs on the judiciary at this point. Just spell out for us what essentially happened in your understanding of that.
Well, there's a lot in that and connected parts, but yeah, the question of the removal of certain Venezuelans was predicated by the president on something called the Alien Enemies Act, which is a law from the beginning of our country, which seems on its face to say that the president has broad power to remove the citizens or subjects of a hostile foreign power in times of war. Particularly uses the phrase declared war or incursion. And it must be a war waged against a foreign government. And the president here is claiming that a Venezuelan gang is effectively an arm of a foreign government that is invading our country. I think that's quite a stretch. The judge in the case that heard it thought it was a misreading or abuse of the terms of that authority. And the president's administration seems to have been, again, I mentioned earlier, kind of playing it fast and loose with some of these rulings of the court. They said, well, the judge said they couldn't do it orally, but that wasn't binding until the written order came from the district court, stretching certainly. Secondly, they said when the written order did come out, the planes were already in the air and outside of the territory of the United States, so beyond the court's power. Also probably a misreading of law. That is the case, and the judge in the case is asking for more details of what happened. The government's been dragging its feet, so they're supposed to make another answer today. There are a lot of open questions, even about how they went through this process, who was on that plane, how the government made any judgment that these folks were members of a gang. So a lot of questions. Certainly, it's a thing that will likely be appealed. And it is true that that the judiciary, particularly a conservative judiciary like we have today, is generally very sympathetic of executive power, particularly over national security issues like this. So it may be of a handful of cases that this administration is really pushing the limits on. They may have slightly better prospects here in court than another one.
But essentially, the judge makes his ruling, Boasberg, and then Trump says, this guy's a lefty lawyer, we should impeach him. And sure enough, a Republican stooge steps up and calls for his impeachment, which is something that happens in Congress, not the judiciary.
Yes.
I mean, just spell out for us, what does it mean to the judiciary? What does it mean to the judges if they feel they can't make a ruling without facing impeachment or censure by the president himself?
This is a direct threat to the independence of the judiciary that is a cornerstone of our system. There has been a campaign by Trump and his allies for weeks or months since he came into the White House again, calling every hostile decision of courts somehow the product of left-wing activists, illegitimate. There's been a campaign to impeach and remove judges who rule against Trump. A number of them. I was just in the House of Representatives building last week, and I saw outside a congressman's office wanted signs for federal judges who had ruled against the administration.
Unbelievable.
So yeah, the impeachment process. Our judges serve for life. It's how we guarantee an independent judiciary isolated from political pressure. We have this option of impeachment, where Congress can accuse a judge of committing crimes, essentially, and remove them. It's been understood since the beginning of our country, in the early 1800s, that you do not impeach a judge based on his ruling. If he commits crime, graft, bribery, sure, probably also non-criminal behavior such as habitual drunkenness or conduct unbecoming the office, but not for rulings with which you disagree. Yeah. We have a process. There are 3 levels of the judiciary. If you don't like the ruling, you appeal it to the next higher court. If you don't like that, you have the Supreme Court. But we don't remove judges for this reason. Some people draw comfort in the idea that, well, the burden to remove a judge is very high. You need a kind of a 2/3 vote from the Senate. Unlikely to happen. But nonetheless, even if they don't succeed in removing judges, what they're doing is exposing them to this campaign of ridicule and delegitimization that is, one, I think, dangerous in our times, just from a fiscal standpoint, but two, makes the case that I think is attempting to create a permission structure for the president to disregard rulings, because and the biggest backstop we have against the president disregarding rulings is public outrage, which we would have had in the past. But I think the hope and the design of this campaign about impeachment is to get a significant portion of the American people to approve of the president disregarding the courts and disregarding the law.
So, Greg, let me ask you something. If democracy depends on the three equal branches, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and we start to see the eroding of one, maybe two, and the power now lying above everything else with the executive, would you still call that a democracy?
No, not the American democracy that we believe in, that was framed in 1789 in Philadelphia. No, I mean it's a fundamental affront to our constitutional system, and having elections every 4 years, even free ones, for an unrestrained presidency is not consistent with the rule of law or with ordered liberty as we've known it and fought for generations. I mean, that's why an organization that like mine exists. We are primarily Republicans and right of center lawyers who have always cared about the Constitution and defending American traditions. And to see them under assault, particularly from the political right, is painful for us.
Do you still believe that you are living in an American democracy?
I do. I believe it's under great pressure. And I'm very worried about what's to come if people don't, and particularly Republicans, don't start waking up to the great threats we face, and tearing down the structures of our government, which are designed to protect our liberties, just to advance some policy agenda that you might agree with, is incredibly short-sighted.
And let me just ask you this, because Donald Trump, kind of almost sounding as if it's a biblical quote, says, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." As an interpretation of American jurisprudence, what do you think of that?
Yeah, that is not the case. A president is not above the law. A do-gooder is not above the law. The law protects us all, and a restrained presidency is a key part of preserving American liberty under law. And liberty under law is the key kind of promise of our system. And a proclamation like that from the president, even if it was meant to be cheeky, is really betrays his oath of office, his duty of stewardship of the Constitution, and really everything that makes our system work in America.
And you said at the start of our interview that there were elements in which they were playing fast and loose. Do you think that was carelessness, or do you think it is deliberate?
I think it's deliberate. I think they're trying to see what they can get away with. They're trying to be selective about the fights they pick with the judiciary, and they're trying to set up a major conflict to reorder federal power in a way that strengthens an already excessively strong presidency against the other branches. So no, I think it's a deliberate campaign. I think the first administration of Trump was in some regards characterized by a degree of chaos. This one is much more controlled towards an end, and that end is not one that I welcome. And I think Americans should broadly be alarmed regardless of their political preferences.
Overnight, we saw a rare intervention from the Chief Justice John Roberts, essentially, without naming him, slapping Trump down. You've worked closely with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. You will know other Republicans closely in this administration. Trump may not care. Do they?
They do. They do. Well, some of them do.
Well, let's start with Rubio.
I can no longer speak for Senator Rubio. I worked for him for several years. All I can say is that I think a lot of what's happening today, both on sort of policy and on the principles, constitutional principles are not consistent with the preferences of Senator Rubio I worked for, or the presidential campaign that I supported when he ran for president against President Trump in 2016. It's just, I mean, what we're seeing from this White House, both in how it approaches the law and the Constitution and some of its priorities with respect to foreign policy and domestic policy, are not consistent with the values that animated most Republicans in Washington over my career. So a lot of folks in this administration are sympathizers of it, wish the best for it, maybe prefer it to the left, but do have deep concerns about much of what's going on. But the president and his political operation are very powerful. And it's been shown to date that opposing the president is perilous professionally for Republicans. So people are reluctant to do it publicly. And I think it's why the administration is, as it engineers conflicts with the court, I think is trying to be selective in engineering conflicts that it thinks it can win. So they want to make this issue with the deportation of Venezuelans not about the president's power in the public mind, but about violent foreign criminals. And who are you siding with? Them or violent, we need to remind people, I try to remind people that it's not about the parties to that case. It's about the rule of law that ultimately protects us all.
Gregg Nunziata, it's sobering stuff. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the conversation this morning.
It gives me no pleasure to say this to you because we are friends, but I think you caved. I think you and 9 other Democrats caved. I don't think you showed the fight that this party needs right now because you're playing with by a rule book where the other party has thrown that rule book away.
True.
And so in my view, what you did really was, in supporting that GOP partisan bill that Democrats had no input in, you cleared the way for Donald Trump and Elon Musk to gut Social Security, to gut Medicare, to gut Medicaid. Why did you lead Democratic senators to play by that book that the Republicans are not playing by?
Okay, first, I'd say, Sonny, no one wants to fight more than me, and no one fights more than me. You got to fight smart. It is not true. That bill had far less it was bad. I hated it. But it does far less damage to Social Security.
That is Chuck Schumer, the Senate Minority Leader, getting a right old kicking for what he did last week, which was there was a cliff edge vote on whether the government would be funded to carry on work. It's a kind of staple of American politics, this kind of endless battle to keep the government funded. And Chuck Schumer led a number of Democratic senators to back the government's spending bill so that the government would stay open. In effect, giving Trump what he wanted, the ability to introduce those legislative changes that will have such a profound effect. And not surprisingly, everyone is pretty damn pissed off with Chuck Schumer right now.
Yeah, you heard the host there, Sonny, essentially speaking on behalf of, I guess, the sort of firebrand wing of younger, possibly, newer, possibly, Democrats like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, maybe Hakeem Jeffries as well, who just think you cannot take this stuff lying down. You've got to get up, kick, maybe punch Trump in the face. And where it gets complicated is because Trump's actions would have led to a government shutdown, essentially. And the Democrats broadly are opposed to shutting down the government, and Trump and the Republicans, his mould of Republicans, are not opposed to shutting down the government. So there were a lot of Democrats, Chuck Schumer amongst them, who thought, if we let Trump shut down the government, frankly, we'll never get it open again. They'll use it as a way of expediting DOGE, expediting more cuts, expediting more, in commas, efficiencies. We will never actually see government up and running and essentially doing its job. And so he speaks on behalf of people who think, you know what? We don't want to be the party that makes people feel even worse. We're not going to have the wrong fight. We're going to have the right fight when we have the right fight. But if you listen to Hakeem Jeffries, who is the House Minority Leader, he was being asked questions by the press. And time and again, he could not find it in him to stand up for what Schumer had done. Just listen to this.
While Donald Trump and House Republicans try to take a chainsaw to these important priorities, of the American people. We'll see what happens over in the Senate. There are still undecided and undeclared senators, and we anxiously await that vote.
Mr. Jeffries, is it time for new leadership in the Senate?
Next question.
Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Leader, first, can you clarify, are you encouraging your Senate colleagues to vote no on cloture, not just the bill itself?
We've been very clear. We strongly oppose the reckless Republican spending bill. Period. Full stop. Our position, repeatedly articulated this week, speaks for itself.
So every time Hakeem Jeffries is saying, next question, what he's basically saying is, he is not really behind Schumer anymore. And I think it speaks to this whole dilemma at the heart of the Democrats right now, which is, do you show your force of anger? Do you show your emotion? Do you actually start really battling with the Republicans under Trump now? Or do you just let them carry on making their mistake?
Two parts of that. I mean, first part is on the vote itself. Democrats have always believed that if it was their votes that caused the shutdown of the government,
they'd be punished.
They're the ones who will get the blame for it, and therefore there is long-term political downside. And when Republicans have voted to close down government or not give the Democrats their support to keep government open when it's been a Democrat president, actually the Republicans have been punished for it by playing sort of fast and loose or whatever. So that's one calculation. I think the other thing we're talking about the Democrats is even more basic than that, which is not whether we fight or don't fight. I think the Democrats are completely and utterly lost at the moment. Yeah. They seem an utter irrelevance in US politics. Their approval ratings have never been lower. An NBC poll found that their approval ratings were 27%, some 20 points behind the Republicans. They are looking at the demographic breakdown of data that comes out of November's election, which is telling them that they lost among young men, that they lost among kind of Hispanics, they lost among Asians, they lost among blacks. And they're thinking, geez, what the hell's happened? What are we for?
And some people are drawing a comparison with the state that the Republican Party was in after Obama won in 2008. And you might remember the emergence of the Tea Party movement around 2010. And the Tea Party, I guess, were a sort of precursor to Trump. They were the people who were very into low taxation, Tea Party as in the Boston Tea Party, as in the independents. They wanted to feel that they could break away, that they could be the newer sort of slightly more insurgent Republican Party who didn't have to follow the rules, the traditional rules of republicanism. And I guess people are asking now whether we're going to see this sort of fissure in the Democrats, whether there are enough people in the Democratic Party now saying, God damn it, we need to be radical now. We need to register that the Democrats have started being the party of the sort of middle upper classes, the wealthy, rather than the party of the working people. We need to recognise that we're not going to get the same, our children aren't going to get the same kind of benefits as our parents had. And maybe there is the beginning, the seeds of this sort of breakaway or this sort of insurgency happening within the Democratic Party where they don't like the old rules anymore. They don't like the old management of the party that they think has dumped them in it. And they think that they've got to kick and scream.
Well, this is so interesting you talk about Obama's victory. And yeah, the Tea Party movement, I always think it's funny that people talk about the Tea Party movement as the natural kind of precursors to Trump, when actually the Tea Party movement was all about fiscal responsibility and not having deficits. And Donald Trump has absolutely ballooned the deficit. Yeah. Anyway, leave that to one side. The Republican Party then embark on this really serious piece of work called the Growth Opportunity Project. It was very much in Mitt Romney's vision of how the Republican Party
of the Tea Party.
Exactly, which was that we need to be kinder, we need to be softer, we need to embrace Hispanic people, we need to embrace this community and that community and not seem like we're a white-only party. Trump comes onto the political stage, totally ignores that playbook, totally rips it up, and yet we look at the 24 election and has absolutely succeeded with Hispanics. Yeah. Absolutely done brilliantly with men, done brilliantly with young people. So there are all sorts of areas where Donald Trump has ripped up the rule book and won. And now the Democratic Party is thinking, geez, maybe we need to do the same.
Yeah, the irony of the Democratic Party thinking this is that, of course, they've only just come away from people saying, oh, you were too woke, you were too left-wing, you scared the horses, people didn't really like you because you weren't sort of centre-right enough. And I guess if you look at what happened to the Democratic Party when Reagan was in power, as soon as the Republicans go right, the Democrats think they have to fight it by going too far to the left, right? And then they end up losing all over again. And so there are people like Chuck Schumer going, don't do this. You know, Joe Biden was a classic one. Don't do this. Just hang in there and work out how we get the centre ground back. But there is enough, I think, anxiety amongst the Democrats now that they may be about to make what historically seemed to be the mistake of the past, which is you then go radical left. You do, if you like, what Corbyn did to the Labour Party here, and it doesn't get you into power.
I want to talk a bit about this right-wing think tank called the Heritage Foundation. They kind of like Liz Truss.
They do. Well, she loves them.
She loves them. And they're well-funded, kind of Thatcherite, Reaganite body that has got a lot of funding. And they are using that funding at the moment. One of their projects is to go to war with Prince Harry. And Prince Harry and his visa application form, and whether it was kosher or not.
Yeah.
And whether he was honest about the fact that he had used drugs. And if he was honest, how on earth did he get a visa? And if he wasn't honest, well, then boot the out.
Yeah, exactly. So a federal judge has now ruled in favour of the Heritage Foundation over their request to see if Harry lied about taking drugs. And they've basically said, here are the documents. Many of the pages, you'll not be surprised to hear, have been redacted, little black boxes everywhere. But essentially they were unsealed in court. His immigration status has been withheld because it might lead to harm and harassment. I mean, he probably gets enough of that anyway, to be honest.
So the thing that is causing me to scratch my head and arch an eyebrow and look puzzled, all those different emojis all at once, is what the hell has it got to do with the Heritage Foundation? Why do they care?
Well, they have argued that, yes, Harry has a right to privacy, but that is outweighed by what they're calling intense public interest in whether he received special treatment during the application process when he moved to the US. In other words, if he had been a normal person who'd taken drugs, his application process would have been blocked. I guess a normal person having taken drugs wouldn't have written a best-selling autobiography and left one country and a royal family in order to move to a 27-bedroom house in Montecito that the whole world knew about. So, yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue that Harry broke his own privacy by doing that. But I think you also have to say, if you think that the royal family has the right to exist as a royal family, there will always be special treatment because you can never get around that.
Well, of course, the Americans would say, we just think that people are the same because we got rid of the royal family, we got rid of George III, and we're a republic, and so no one is above anything else, except that Americans absolutely adore the royal family. I also think there is such a piece of sophistry in the Heritage Foundation saying there is intense public interest. It's in the public interest. There is a difference between the public being interested and it being a matter of public interest. And I think that, maybe the public are interested to see what Harry put on his immigration form, but is it in the public interest that it be revealed? I'm not sure.
I mean, it's also a dig, obviously, at the Biden administration.
Of course.
Because Harry and his team have maintained that they were just truthful in what they said. I don't know, they put it on the papers or they put it in the book. Biden's administration, not Biden obviously, but Biden's administration would be the ones that made the decision. So I guess this is a way of saying, everything the last guy did was crooked.
We will be back next week. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents USA.